Chapter 11, Part 1 of A Diary from Dixie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Diary from Dixie by Mary Chesnut. Chapter 11, Columbia, South Carolina, February 20, 1862, to July 21, 1862. Part 1. Columbia, South Carolina, February 20, 1862. Had an appetite for my dainty breakfast. Always breakfast in bed now. But then my Mercury contained such bad news. That is an appetizing style of matutinal newspaper. Fort Donelson has fallen, but no men fell with it. It is prisoners for them that we can not spare, or prisoners for us that we may not be able to feed. That is so much to be forfended, as Keats says. They lost 6,000, we 2,000. I grudge that proportion. In vain, alas, ye gallant few, few but undismayed. Again they make a stand. We have Buckner, Beauregard, and Albert Sidney Johnston. With such leaders and God's help we may be saved from the hated Yankees. Who knows? Footnote: Fort Donelson stood on the Cumberland River about 60 miles northwest of Nashville. The Confederate garrison numbered about 18,000 men. General Grant invested the fort on February 13, 1862, and General Buckner, who commanded it, surrendered on February 16th. The Federal force at the time of the surrender numbered 27,000 men, their loss in killed and wounded being 2,660 men, and the Confederate loss about 2,000. February 21st. A crowd collected here last night, and there was a serenade. I am like Mrs. Nickleby, who never saw a horse coming full speed, but she thought the Cheerybles had sent post haste to take Nicholas into copartnership. So I got up and dressed, late as it was. I felt sure England had sought our alliance at last, and we would make a Yorktown of it before long. Who was it? Will you ever guess? Artemus Goodwin and General Owens of Florida. Just then Mr. Chesnut rushed in, put out the light, locked the door, and sat still as a mouse. Rap, rap came at the door. "I say, Chesnut, they are calling for you." At last we heard Janney, hotel keeper, loudly proclaiming from the piazza that Colonel Chesnut was not here at all, at all. After a while, when they had all gone from the street, and the very house itself had subsided into perfect quiet, the door again was roughly shaken. "I say, Chesnut, old fellow, come out. I know you are there. Nobody here now wants to hear you make a speech. That crowd has all gone. We want a little quiet talk with you. I am just from Richmond." That was the open sesame, and to day I hear none of the Richmond news is encouraging. Colonel Shaw is blamed for the shameful Roanoke surrender. Footnote: General Burnside captured the Confederate garrison at Roanoke Island on February 8, 1862. End footnote. Toombs is out on a rampage, and swears he will not accept a seat in the Confederate Senate given in the insulting way his was by the Georgia legislature, calls it shabby treatment, and adds that Georgia is not the only place where good men have been so ill used. The Governor and Council have fluttered the dovecotes, or, at least, the tea tables. They talk of making a call for all silver, etc. I doubt if we have enough to make the sacrifice worth while, but we propose to set the example. February 22d. What a beautiful day for our Confederate President to be inaugurated. God speed him, God keep him, God save him. John Chesnut's letter was quite what we needed. In spirit it is all that one could ask. He says: "Our late reverses are acting finely with the Army of the Potomac. A few more thrashings and every man will enlist for the war. Victories made us too sanguine and easy, not to say vainglorious. Now for the rub, and let them have it." A lady wrote to Mrs. Bunch, "Dear Emma, when shall I call for you to go and see Madame de St. André?" She was answered, "Dear Lou, I can not go with you to see Madame de St. André, but will always retain the kindest feeling toward you on account of our past relations," etc. The astounded friend wrote to ask what all this meant. No answer came, and then she sent her husband to ask and demand an explanation. He was answered thus: "My dear fellow, there can be no explanation possible. Hereafter there will be no intercourse between my wife and yours. Simply that, nothing more." So the men meet at the club as before, and there is no further trouble between them. The lady upon whom the slur is cast says, "And I am a woman and can't fight." February 23d. While Mr. Chesnut was in town, I was at the Prestons'. John Cochran and some other prisoners had asked to walk over the grounds, visit the Hampton Gardens, and some friends in Columbia. After the dreadful state of the public mind at the escape of one of the prisoners, General Preston was obliged to refuse his request. Mrs. Preston and the rest of us wanted him to say "yes," and so find out who in Columbia were his treacherous friends. Pretty bold people they must be to receive Yankee invaders in the midst of the row over one enemy already turned loose amid us. General Preston said, "We are about to sacrifice life and fortune for a fickle multitude who will not stand up to us at last." The harsh comments made as to his lenient conduct to prisoners have embittered him. I told him what I had heard Captain Trenholm say in his speech. He said he would listen to no criticism except from a man with a musket on his shoulder, and who had, besides, enlisted for the war, had given up all, and had no choice but to succeed or die. February 24th. Congress and the newspapers render one desperate, ready to cut one's own throat. They represent everything in our country as deplorable. Then comes some one back from our gay and gallant army at the front. The spirit of our army keeps us up, after all. Letters from the army revive one. They come as welcome as the flowers in May, hopeful and bright, utterly unconscious of our weak despondency. February 25th. They have taken at Nashville more men than we had at Manassas. There was bad handling of troops, we poor women think, or this would not be. Nashville was evacuated by the Confederates under Albert Sidney Johnston in February, 1862. Mr. Venable added bitterly, "Giving up our soldiers to the enemy means giving up the cause. We can not replace them." The up country men were Union men generally, and the low country seceders. The former growl; they never liked those aristocratic boroughs and parishes. They had themselves a good and prosperous country, a good constitution, and were satisfied. But they had to leave all and fight for the others who had brought on all the trouble, and who do not show too much disposition to fight for themselves. That is the extreme up country view. The extreme low country says Jeff Davis is not enough out of the Union yet. His inaugural address reads as one of his speeches did 4 years ago in the United States Senate. A letter in a morning paper accused Mr. Chesnut of staying too long in Charleston. The editor was asked for the writer's name. He gave it as Little Moses, the Governor's secretary. When Little Moses was spoken to, in a great trepidation he said that Mrs. Pickens wrote it, and got him to publish it. So it was dropped, for Little Moses is such an arrant liar, no one can believe him. Besides, if that sort of thing amuses Mrs. Pickens, let her amuse herself. March 5th. Mary Preston went back to Mulberry with me from Columbia. She found a man there tall enough to take her in to dinner, Tom Boykin, who is 6 feet 4, the same height as her father. Tom was very handsome in his uniform, and Mary prepared for a nice time, but he looked as if he would so much rather she did not talk to him, and he set her such a good example, saying never a word. Old Colonel Chesnut came for us. When the train stopped, Quashie, shiny black, was seen on his box, as glossy and perfect in his way as his blooded bays. But the old Colonel would stop and pick up the dirtiest little negro I ever saw who was crying by the roadside. This ragged little black urchin was made to climb up and sit beside Quash. It spoilt the symmetry of the turnout, but it was a character touch, and the old gentleman knows no law but his own will. He had a biscuit in his pocket, which he gave this sniffling little negro, who proved to be his man Skip's son. I was ill at Mulberry and never left my room. Dr. Boykin came, more military than medical. Colonel Chesnut brought him up, also Teams, who said he was down in the mouth. Our men were not fighting as they should. We had only pluck and luck and a dogged spirit of fighting, to offset their weight in men and munitions of war. I wish I could remember Team's words. This is only his idea. His language was quaint and striking. No grammar, but no end of sense and good feeling. Old Colonel Chesnut, catching a word, began his litany saying, "Numbers will tell," "Napoleon, you know," etc., etc. At Mulberry the war has been ever afar off, but threats to take the silver came very near indeed silver that we had before the Revolution silver that Mrs. Chesnut brought from Philadelphia. Jack Cantey and Dr. Boykin came back on the train with us. Wade Hampton is the hero. Sweet May Dacre. Lord Byron and Disraeli make their rosebuds Catholic. May Dacre is another Aurora Raby. I like Disraeli because I find so many clever things in him. I like the sparkle and the glitter. Carlyle does not hold up his hands in holy horror of us because of African slavery. Lord Lyons has gone against us. Richard Lord Lyons, British Minister to the United States from 1858 to 1865. Lord Derby and Louis Napoleon are silent in our hour of direst need. People call me Cassandra, for I cry that outside hope is quenched. From the outside no help indeed cometh to this beleaguered land. March 7th. Mrs. Middleton was dolorous indeed. General Lee had warned the planters about Combahee, etc., that they must take care of themselves now; he could not do it. Confederate soldiers had committed some outrages on the plantations, and officers had punished them promptly. She poured contempt upon Yancey's letter to Lord Russell. Lord Russell was Foreign Secretary under the Palmerston administration of 1859 to 1865. It was the letter of a shopkeeper, not in the style of a statesman at all. We called to see Mary McDuffie. Mary McDuffie was the second wife of Wade Hampton. She asked Mary Preston what Dr. Boykin had said of her husband as we came along in the train. She heard it was something very complimentary. Mary P. tried to remember and to repeat it all, to the joy of the other Mary, who liked to hear nice things about her husband. Mary was amazed to hear of the list of applicants for promotion. One delicate minded person accompanied his demand for advancement by a request for a written description of the Manassas battle; he had heard Colonel Chesnut give such a brilliant account of it in Governor Cobb's room. The Merrimac business has come like a gleam of lightning illumining a dark scene. Our sky is black and lowering. The Merrimac was formerly a 40-gun screw frigate of the United States Navy. In April, 1861, when the Norfolk Navy Yard was abandoned by the United States, she was sunk. Her hull was afterward raised by the Confederates, and she was reconstructed on new plans and renamed the Virginia. On March 2, 1862, she destroyed the Congress, a sailing ship of 50 guns, and the Cumberland, a sailing ship of 30 guns, at Newport News. On March 7th she attacked the Minnesota, but was met by the Monitor and defeated in a memorable engagement. Many features of modern battleships have been derived from the Merrimac and Monitor. The Judge saw his little daughter at my window, and he came up. He was very smooth and kind. It was really a delightful visit; not a disagreeable word was spoken. He abused no one whatever, for he never once spoke of any one but himself, and himself he praised without stint. He did not look at me once, though he spoke very kindly to me. March 10th, second year of Confederate independence. I write daily for my own diversion. These memoirs pour servir may at some future day afford facts about these times and prove useful to more important people than I am. I do not wish to do any harm or to hurt any one. If any scandalous stories creep in, they can easily be burned. It is hard, in such a hurry as things are now, to separate the wheat from the chaff. Now that I have made my protest and written down my wishes, I can scribble on with a free will and free conscience. Congress at the North is down on us. They talk largely of hanging slave owners. They say they hold Port Royal, as we did when we took it originally from the aborigines, who fled before us. So we are to be exterminated and improved, à l'Indienne, from the face of the earth. Medea, when asked, "Country, wealth, husband, children, all are gone, and now what remains?" answered, "Medea remains." There is a time in most men's lives when they resemble Job, sitting among the ashes and drinking in the full bitterness of complicated misfortune. March 11th. A freshman came quite eager to be instructed in all the wiles of society. He wanted to try his hand at a flirtation, and requested minute instructions, as he knew nothing whatever, he was so very fresh. Dance with her, he was told, and talk with her, walk with her, and flatter her. Dance until she is warm and tired, then propose to walk in a cool, shady piazza. It must be a somewhat dark piazza. Begin your promenade slowly, warm up to your work, draw her arm closer and closer, then break her wing. Heavens, what is that? Break her wing? Why, you do not know even that? Put your arm round her waist and kiss her. After that it is all plain sailing. She comes down when you call like the coon to Captain Scott. You need not fire, Captain, etc. The aspirant for fame as a flirt followed these lucid directions literally, but when he seized the poor girl and kissed her, she uplifted her voice in terror and screamed as if the house was on fire. So quick, sharp, and shrill were her yells for help that the bold flirt sprang over the banister, upon which grew a strong climbing rose. This he struggled through and ran toward the college, taking a bee line. He was so mangled by the thorns that he had to go home and have them picked out by his family. The girl's brother challenged him. There was no mortal combat, however, for the gay young fellow who had led the freshman's ignorance astray stepped forward and put things straight. An explanation and an apology at every turn hushed it all up. Now we all laughed at this foolish story most heartily, but Mr. Venable remained grave and preoccupied, and was asked, "Why are you so unmoved? It is funny." I like more probable fun. I have been in college and I have kissed many a girl, but never a one scrome yet. Last Saturday was the bloodiest we have had in proportion to numbers. On March 7 and 8, 1862, occurred the battle of Pea Ridge in western Arkansas, where the Confederates were defeated, and on March 8th and 9th occurred the conflict in Hampton Roads between the warships Merrimac, Cumberland, Congress, and Monitor. The enemy lost 1,500. The handful left at home are rushing to arms at last. Bragg has gone to join Beauregard at Columbus, Mississippi. Old Abe truly took the field in that Scotch cap of his. Mrs. McCord, the eldest daughter of Langdon Cheves, got up a company for her son, raising it at her own expense. Louisa Susanna McCord, whose husband was David J. McCord, a lawyer of Columbia, who died in 1855. She was educated in Philadelphia and was the author of several books of verse, including Caius Gracchus, a Tragedy. She was also a brilliant pamphleteer. She has the brains and energy of a man. To day she repeated a remark of a low country gentleman who is dissatisfied. This government (Confederate) protects neither person nor property. Fancy the scornful turn of her lip. Someone asked for Langdon Cheves, her brother. "Oh, Langdon," she replied coolly. "He is a pure patriot. He has no ambition. While I was there he was letting Confederate soldiers ditch through his garden and ruin him at their leisure." Cotton is 5 cents a pound, and labor of no value at all. It commands no price whatever. People gladly hire out their negroes to have them fed and clothed, which latter can not be done. Cotton Osnaburg at 37½ cents a yard leaves no chance to clothe them. Langdon was for martial law and making the bloodsuckers disgorge their ill-gotten gains. We, poor fools, who are patriotically ruining ourselves, will see our children in the gutter, while treacherous dogs of millionaires go rolling by in their coaches that were acquired by taking advantage of our necessities. This terrible battle of the ships, Monitor, Merrimac, etc. All hands on board the Cumberland went down. She fought gallantly and fired around as she sank. The Congress ran up a white flag. She fired on our boats as they went up to take off her wounded. She was burned. The worst of it is that all this will arouse them to more furious exertions to destroy us. They hated us so before, but how now? In Columbia I do not know a half dozen men who would not gaily step into Jeff Davis's shoes with a firm conviction that they would do better in every respect than he does. The monstrous conceit, the fatuous ignorance of these critics! It is pleasant to hear Mrs. McCord on this subject, when they begin to shake their heads and tell us what Jeff Davis ought to do. End of Chapter 11, Part 1. Part 2 of A Diary from Dixie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Laurie Anne Walden. A Diary from Dixie by Mary Chesnut. Chapter 11, Columbia, South Carolina, Part 2. March 12th. In the naval battle the other day we had 25 guns in all. The enemy had 54 in the Cumberland, 44 in the St. Lawrence, besides a fleet of gunboats filled with rifled cannon. Why not? They can have as many as they please. No pent-up Utica contracts their powers, the whole boundless world being theirs to recruit in. Ours is only this one little spot of ground, the blockade, or stockade, which hems us in with only the sky open to us, and for all that how tender-footed and cautious they are as they draw near. An anonymous letter purports to answer Colonel Chesnut's address to South Carolinians now in the Army of the Potomac. The man says, "All that bosh is no good." He knows lots of people whose fathers were notorious Tories in our war for independence and made fortunes by selling their country. Their sons have the best places, and they are cowards and traitors still. Names are given, of course. Floyd and Pillow are suspended from their commands because of Fort Donelson. The people of Tennessee demand a like fate for Albert Sidney Johnston. They say he is stupid. Can human folly go further than this Tennessee madness? Footnote: John D. Floyd, who had been Governor of Virginia from 1850 to 1853, became Secretary of War in 1857. He was first in command at Fort Donelson. Gideon J. Pillow had been a major general of volunteers in the Mexican War and was second in command at Fort Donelson. He and Floyd escaped from the fort when it was invested by Grant, leaving General Buckner to make the surrender. End footnote. I did Mrs. a kindness. I told the women when her name came up that she was childless now, but that she had lost 3 children. I hated to leave her all alone. Women have such a contempt for a childless wife. Now they will be all sympathy and goodness. I took away her reproach among women. March 13th. Mr. Chesnut fretting and fuming. From the poor old blind bishop downward, everybody is besetting him to let off students, theological and other, from going into the army. One comfort is that the boys will go. Mr. Chesnut answers, "Wait until you have saved your country before you make preachers and scholars. When you have a country, there will be no lack of divines, students, scholars, to adorn and purify it." He says he is a one-idea man. That idea is to get every possible man into the ranks. Professor LeConte is an able auxiliary. He has undertaken to supervise and carry on the powder-making enterprise, the very first attempted in the Confederacy, and Mr. Chesnut is proud of it. It is a brilliant success, thanks to LeConte. Footnote: Joseph LeConte, who afterward arose to much distinction as a geologist and writer of textbooks on geology. He died in 1901 while he was connected with the University of California. His work at Columbia was to manufacture, on a large scale, medicines for the Confederate army, his laboratory being the main source of supply. In Professor LeConte's autobiography, published in 1903, are several chapters devoted to his life in the South. End footnote. Mr. Chesnut receives anonymous letters urging him to arrest the Judge as seditious. They say he is a dangerous and disaffected person. His abuse of Jeff Davis and the Council is rabid. Mr. Chesnut laughs and throws the letters into the fire. "Disaffected to Jeff Davis," says he. "Disaffected to the Council, that don't count. He knows what he is about. He would not injure his country for the world." Read Uncle Tom's Cabin again. These negro women have a chance here that women have nowhere else. They can redeem themselves; the impropers can. They can marry decently, and nothing is remembered against these colored ladies. It is not a nice topic, but Mrs. Stowe revels in it. How delightfully Pharisaic a feeling it must be to rise superior and fancy we are so degraded as to defend and like to live with such degraded creatures around us, such men as Legree and his women. The best way to take negroes to your heart is to get as far away from them as possible. As far as I can see, Southern women do all that missionaries could do to prevent and alleviate evils. The social evil has not been suppressed in Old England or in New England, in London or in Boston. People in those places expect more virtue from a plantation African than they can insure in practice among themselves with all their own high moral surroundings, light, education, training, and support. Lady Mary Montagu says, "Only men and women at last." "Male and female created He them," says the Bible. There are cruel, graceful, beautiful mothers of angelic Evas, North as well as South, I dare say. The Northern men and women who came here were always hardest, for they expected an African to work and behave as a white man. We do not. I have often thought from observation truly that perfect beauty hardens the heart. And as to grace, what so graceful as a cat, a tigress, or a panther? Much love, admiration, worship hardens an idol's heart. It becomes utterly callous and selfish. It expects to receive all and to give nothing. It even likes the excitement of seeing people suffer. I speak now of what I have watched with horror and amazement. Topsies I have known, but none that were beaten or ill used. Evas are mostly in the heaven of Mrs. Stowe's imagination. People can't love things dirty, ugly, and repulsive, simply because they ought to do so, but they can be good to them at a distance. That's easy. You see, I cannot rise very high. I can only judge by what I see. March 14th. Thank God for a ship! It has run the blockade with arms and ammunition. There are no negro sexual relations half so shocking as Mormonism. And yet the United States government makes no bones of receiving Mormons into its Sacred Heart. Mr. Venable said England held her hand over "the malignant and the turbaned Turk" to save and protect him, slaves, seraglio, and all. But she rolls up the whites of her eyes at us when slavery, bad as it is stepping out into freedom every moment through Christian civilization. They do not grudge the Turk even his bag and Bosphorus privileges. To a recalcitrant wife it is, "Here yawns the sack, there rolls the sea," etc. And France, the bold, the brave, the ever free, she has not been so tender-footed in Algiers. But then, the "you are another" argument is a shabby one. "You see," says Mary Preston sagaciously, "we are white Christian descendants of Huguenots and Cavaliers, and they expect of us different conduct." Went in Mrs. Preston's landau to bring my boarding school girls here to dine. At my door met J. F., who wanted me then and there to promise to help him with his commission or put him in the way of one. At the carriage steps I was handed in by Gus Smith, who wants his brother made commissary. The beauty of it all is they think I have some influence, and I have not a particle. The subject of Mr. Chesnut's military affairs, promotions, etc., is never mentioned by me. March 15th. When we came home from Richmond, there stood Warren Nelson propped up against my door, lazily waiting for me, the handsome creature. He said he meant to be heard, so I walked back with him to the drawing room. They are wasting their time dancing attendance on me. I can not help them. Let them shoulder their musket and go to the wars like men. After tea came Mars Kit. He said for a talk, but that Mr. Preston would not let him have, for Mr. Preston had arrived some time before him. Mr. Preston said Mars Kit thought it bad form to laugh. After that you may be sure a laugh from Mars Kit was secured. Again and again he was forced to laugh with a will. I reversed Oliver Wendell Holmes's good resolution never to be as funny as he could. I did my very utmost. Mr. Venable interrupted the fun, which was fast and furious, with the very best of bad news. New Bern shelled and burned, cotton, turpentine, everything. There were 5,000 North Carolinians in the fray, 12,000 Yankees. Now there stands Goldsboro. One more step and we are cut in two. The railroad is our backbone, like the Blue Ridge and the Alleghanies, with which it runs parallel. So many discomforts, no wonder we are downhearted. Mr. Venable thinks as we do. Garnett is our most thorough scholar, Lamar the most original, and the cleverest of our men. L.Q.C. Lamar; time fails me to write all his name. Then there is R.M.T. Hunter. Muscoe Russell Garnett and his Northern wife, that match was made at my house in Washington when Garnett was a member of the United States Congress. March 17th. Back to the Congaree house to await my husband, who has made a rapid visit to the Wateree region. As we drove up, Mr. Chesnut said, "Did you see the stare of respectful admiration E.R. bestowed upon you, so curiously prolonged? I could hardly keep my countenance." "Yes, my dear child, I feel the honor of it, though my individual self goes for nothing in it. I am the wife of the man who has the appointing power just now, with so many commissions to be filled. I am nearly 40, and they do my understanding the credit to suppose I can be made to believe they admire my mature charms. They think they fool me into thinking that they believe me charming. There is hardly any farce in the world more laughable. Last night a house was set on fire. Last week 2 houses. The red cock crows in the barn. Our troubles thicken, indeed, when treachery comes from that dark quarter. When the President first offered Johnston Pettigrew a brigadier generalship, his answer was, "Not yet. Too many men are ahead of me who have earned their promotion in the field. I will come after them, not before. So far I have done nothing to merit reward," etc. He would not take rank when he could get it. I fancy he may cool his heels now waiting for it. He was too high and mighty. There was another conscientious man, Burnet of Kentucky. He gave up his regiment to his lieutenant colonel when he found the lieutenant colonel could command the regiment and Burnet could not maneuver it in the field. He went into the fight simply as an aide to Floyd. Modest merit just now is at a premium. William Gilmore Simms is here. Read us his last poetry. Have forgotten already what it was about. It was not tiresome, however, and that is a great thing when people will persist in reading their own rhymes. I did not hear what Mr. Preston was saying. "The last piece of Richmond news," Mr. Chesnut said as he went away, and he looked so fagged out I asked no questions. I knew it was bad. At daylight there was a loud knocking at my door. I hurried on a dressing gown and flew to open the door. "Mrs. Chesnut, Mrs. M. says please don't forget her son. Mr. Chesnut, she hears, has come back. Please get her son a commission. He must have an office." I shut the door in the servant's face. If I had the influence these foolish people attribute to me, why should I not help my own? I have a brother, 2 brothers-in-law, and no end of kin, all gentlemen privates, and privates they would stay to the end of time before they said a word to me about commissions. After a long talk we were finally disgusted, and the men went off to the bulletin board. Whatever else it shows, good or bad, there is always woe for some house in the killed and wounded. We have need of stout hearts. I feel a sinking of mine as we drive near the board. March 18th. My war archon is beset for commissions, and somebody says for every one given you make one ingrate and 1,000 enemies. As I entered Miss Mary Stark's, I whispered, "He has promised to vote for Lewis." What radiant faces! To my friend, Miss Mary said, "Your son-in-law, what is he doing for his country?" "He is a tax collector." Then spoke up the stout old girl, "Look at my cheek; it is red with blushing for you. A great, hale, hearty young man. Fie on him! Fie on him! For shame! Tell his wife, run him out of the house with a broomstick; send him down to the coast at least." Fancy my cheeks! I could not raise my eyes to the poor lady so mercilessly assaulted. My face was as hot with compassion as the outspoken Miss Mary pretended hers to be with vicarious mortification. Went to see sweet and saintly Mrs. Bartow. She read us a letter from Mississippi. Not so bad. More men there than the enemy suspected, and torpedoes to blow up the wretches when they came. Next to see Mrs. Izard. She had with her a relative just from the North. This lady had asked Seward for passports, and he told her to hold on a while; the road to South Carolina will soon be open to all, Open and safe. To day Mrs. Arthur Hayne heard from her daughter that Richmond is to be given up. Mrs. Buell is her daughter. Met Mr. Chesnut, who said, "New Madrid has been given up." I do not know any more than the dead where New Madrid is. It is bad all the same, this giving up. I can't stand it. The hemming in process is nearly complete. The ring of fire is almost unbroken. New Madrid, Missouri, had been under siege since March 3, 1862. Mr. Chesnut's negroes offered to fight for him if he would arm them. He pretended to believe them. He says one man can not do it. The whole country must agree to it. He would trust such as he would select, and he would give so many acres of land and his freedom to each one as he enlisted. Mrs. Albert Rhett came for an office for her son John. I told her Mr. Chesnut would never propose a kinsman for an office, but if any one else would bring him forward, he would vote for him, certainly, as he is so eminently fit for position. Now he is a private. March 19th. He who runs may read. Conscription means that we are in a tight place. This war was a volunteer business. To morrow conscription begins, the dernier ressort. The President has remodeled his cabinet, leaving Bragg for North Carolina. His war minister is Randolph of Virginia. A Union man par excellence, Watts of Alabama, is Attorney General. And now, too late by 1 year, when all the mechanics are in the army, Mallory begins to telegraph Captain Ingraham to build ships at any expense. We are locked in and can not get the requisites for naval architecture, says a magniloquent person. Henry Frost says all hands wink at cotton going out. Why not send it out and buy ships? Every now and then there is a holocaust of cotton burning, says the magniloquent. Conscription has waked the Rip Van Winkles. The streets of Columbia were never so crowded with men. To fight and to be made to fight are different things. To my small wits, whenever people were persistent, united, and rose in their might, no general, however great, succeeded in subjugating them. Have we not swamps, forests, rivers, mountains, every natural barrier? The Carthaginians begged for peace because they were a luxurious people and could not endure the hardship of war, though the enemy suffered as sharply as they did. Factions among themselves is the rock on which we split. Now for the great soul who is to rise up and lead us. Why tarry his footsteps? March 20th. The Merrimac is now called the Virginia. I think these changes of names so confusing and so senseless. Like the French Royal Bengal Tiger, National Tiger, etc. Rue this, and next day rue that, the very days and months a symbol, and nothing signified. I was lying on the sofa in my room, and two men slowly walking up and down the corridor talked aloud as if necessarily all rooms were unoccupied at this midday hour. I asked Maum Mary who they were. Yeadon and Barnwell Rhett, Jr. They abused the council roundly, and my husband's name arrested my attention. Afterward, when Yeadon attacked Mr. Chesnut surprised him by knowing beforehand all he had to say. Naturally, I had repeated the loud interchange of views I had overheard in the corridor. First, Nathan Davis called. Then Gonzales, who presented a fine, soldierly appearance in his soldier clothes, and the likeness to Beauregard was greater than ever. Nathan, all the world knows, is by profession a handsome man. General Gonzales told us what in the bitterness of his soul he had written to Jeff Davis. He regretted that he had not been his classmate, then he might have been as well treated as Northrop. In any case, he would not have been refused a brigadiership, citing General Trapier and Tom Drayton. He had worked for it, had earned it; they had not. To his surprise, Mr. Davis answered him, and in a sharp note of 4 pages. Mr. Davis demanded from whom he quoted, not his classmate. General Gonzales responded, "From the public voice only." Now he will fight for us all the same, but go on demanding justice from Jeff Davis until he gets his dues. At least, until one of them gets his dues, for he means to go on hitting Jeff Davis over the head whenever he has a chance. "I am afraid," said I, "you will find it a hard head to crack." He replied in his flowery Spanish way. Jeff Davis will be the sun radiating all light, heat, and patronage. He will not be a moon reflecting public opinion, for he has the soul of a despot; he delights to spite public opinion. See, people abused him for making Crittenden brigadier. Straightway he made him major general, and just after a blundering, besotted defeat, too. Also he told the President in that letter, Napoleon made his generals after great deeds on their part, and not for having been educated at St. Cyr or Brie or the Polytechnique, etc., etc. Nathan Davis sat as still as a Sioux warrior, not an eyelash moved. And yet he said afterward that he was amused while the Spaniard railed at his great namesake. Gonzales said, Mrs. Slidell would proudly say that she was a Creole. They were such fools, they thought Creole meant. Here Nathan interrupted pleasantly. At the St. Charles, in New Orleans, on the bill of fare were Creole eggs. When they were brought to a man who had ordered them, with perfect simplicity, he held them up. Why, they are only hens' eggs, after all. What in heaven's name he expected them to be, who can say? Smiled Nathan the elegant. One lady says, as I sit reading in the drawing room window while Ma Mary puts my room to rights, I clothe my negroes well. I could not bear to see them in dirt and rags; it would be unpleasant to me. Another lady, yes, well, so do I, but not fine clothes, you know. I feel, now, it was one of our sins as a nation, the way we indulged them in sinful finery. We will be punished for it. Last night Mrs. Pickens met General Cooper. Madam knew General Cooper only as our adjutant general and Mr. Mason's brother-in-law. In her slow, graceful, impressive way, her beautiful eyes eloquent with feeling, she inveighed against Mr. Davis's wickedness in always sending men born at the North to command at Charleston. General Cooper is on his way to make a tour of inspection there now. The dear general settled his head on his cravat with the aid of his forefinger; he tugged rather more nervously with the something that is always wrong inside of his collar, and looked straight up through his spectacles. Some one crossed the room, stood back of Mrs. Pickens, and murmured in her ear, "General Cooper was born in New York." Sudden silence. Dined with General Cooper at the Prestons'. General Hampton and Blanton Duncan were there also, the latter a thoroughly free and easy Western man, handsome and clever, more audacious than either, perhaps. He pointed to Buck, Sally Buchanan Campbell Preston. "What's that girl laughing at?" Poor child, how amazed she looked. He bade them not despair; all the nice young men would not be killed in the war; there would be a few left. For himself, he could give them no hope; Mrs. Duncan was uncommonly healthy. Mrs. Duncan is also lovely; we have seen her. End of chapter 11, part 2. Part 3 of A Diary from Dixie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Laurie Anne Walden. A Diary from Dixie by Mary Chesnut. Chapter 11, Columbia, South Carolina, Part 3. March 24th. I was asked to the Tognos' tea, so refused to drive with Mary Preston. As I sat at my solitary casement, waiting for the time to come for the Tognos, saw Mrs. Preston's landau pass, and Mr. Venable making Mary laugh at some of his army stories, as only Mr. Venable can. Already I felt that I had paid too much for my whistle, that is, the Togno tea. The Gibbses, Trenholms, Edmund Rhett there. Edmund Rhett has very fine eyes, and makes fearful play with them. He sits silent and motionless, with his hands on his knees, his head bent forward, and his eyes fixed upon you. I could think of nothing like it but a setter and a covey of partridges. As to President Davis, he sank to profounder deeps of abuse of him than even Gonzales. I quoted Yancey: "A crew may not like their captain, but if they are mad enough to mutiny while a storm is raging, all hands are bound to go to the bottom." After that I contented myself with a mild shake of the head when I disagreed with him, and at last I began to shake so persistently it amounted to incipient palsy. "Jeff Davis," he said, "is conceited, wrong-headed, wranglesome, obstinate, a traitor." "Now I have borne much in silence," said I at last, "but that is pernicious nonsense. Do not let us waste any more time listening to your quotations from the Mercury." He very good-naturedly changed the subject, which was easy just then, for a delicious supper was on the table ready for us. But Doctor Gibbes began anew the fighting. He helped me to some pâté. "Not foie gras," said Madame Togno. "Pâté perdreau." Doctor Gibbes, however, gave it a flavor of his own. "Eat it," said he. "It is good for you, rich and wholesome, healthy as cod liver oil." A queer thing happened. At the post office a man saw a small boy open with a key the box of the Governor and the Council, take the contents of the box, and run for his life. Of course this man called to the urchin to stop. The urchin did not heed, but seeing himself pursued began tearing up the letters and papers. He was caught and the fragments were picked up. Finding himself a prisoner, he pointed out the negro who gave him the key. The negro was arrested. Governor Pickens called to see me to day. We began with Fort Sumter. For an hour did we hammer at that fortress. We took it gun by gun. He was very pleasant and friendly in his manner. James Chesnut has been so nice this winter, so reasonable and considerate, that is, for a man. The night I came from Madame Togno's, instead of making a row about the lateness of the hour, he said he was so wide awake and so hungry. I put on my dressing gown and scrambled some eggs, etc., there on our own fire. And with our feet on the fender and the small supper table between us, we enjoyed the supper and glorious gossip. Rather a pleasant state of things when one's own husband is in good humor and cleverer than all the men outside. This afternoon, the entente cordiale still subsisting, Maum Mary beckoned me out mysteriously, but Mr. Chesnut said, "Speak out, old woman, nobody here but myself." "Mars Nathum Davis wants to speak to her," said she. So I hurried off to the drawing room, Maum Mary flapping her down at the heels shoes in my wake. "He's gwine because somebody done stole his boots. How could he stay bidout boots?" So Nathan said good by. Then we met General Gist, Maum Mary still hovering near, and I congratulated him on being promoted. He is now a brigadier. This he received with modest complaisance. "I knowed he was a general," said Maum Mary as he passed on. "He told me as soon as he got in his room before his boy put down his trunks." As Nathan, the unlucky, said good by, he informed me that a Mr. Reed from Montgomery was in the drawing room and wanted to see me. Mr. Reed had traveled with our foreign envoy, Yancey. I was keen for news from abroad. Mr. Reed settled that summarily. "Mr. Yancey says we need not have one jot of hope. He could bowstring Mallory for not buying arms in time. The very best citizens wanted to depose the State government and take things into their own hands, the powers that be being inefficient. Western men are hurrying to the front, bestirring themselves. In 2 more months we shall be ready." What could I do but laugh? I do hope the enemy will be considerate and charitable enough to wait for us. Mr. Reed's calm faith in the power of Mr. Yancey's eloquence was beautiful to see. He asked for Mr. Chesnut. I went back to our rooms, swelling with news like a pouter pigeon. Mr. Chesnut said, "Well, 4 hours! A call from Nathan Davis of 4 hours!" Men are too absurd. So I bear the honors of my 40 years gallantly. I can but laugh. "Mr. Nathan Davis went by the 5 o'clock train," I said. "It is now about 6 or 7, maybe 8. I have had so many visitors. Mr. Reed of Alabama is asking for you out there." He went without a word, but I doubt if he went to see Mr. Reed. My laughing had made him so angry. At last Lincoln threatens us with a proclamation abolishing slavery, here in the free Southern Confederacy. And they say McClellan is deposed. They want more fighting. I mean the government, whose skins are safe, they want more fighting, and trust to luck for the skill of the new generals. Footnote: The Emancipation Proclamation was not actually issued until September 22, 1862, when it was a notice to the Confederates to return to the Union, emancipation being proclaimed as a result of their failure to do so. The real proclamation, freeing the slaves, was delayed until January 1, 1863, when it was put forth as a war measure. Mrs. Chesnut's reference is doubtless to President Lincoln's message to Congress, March 6, 1862, in which he made recommendations regarding the abolition of slavery. March 28th. I did leave with regret Maum Mary. She was such a good, well informed old thing. My Molly, though perfection otherwise, does not receive the confidential communications of new made generals at the earliest moment. She is of very limited military information. Maum Mary was the comfort of my life. She saved me from all trouble as far as she could. 70, if she is a day, she is as spry and active as a cat, of a curiosity that knows no bounds, black and clean. Also, she knows a joke at first sight, and she is honest. I fancy the negroes are ashamed to rob people as careless as James Chesnut and myself. One night, just before we left the Congaree house, Mr. Chesnut had forgotten to tell some all-important thing to Governor Gist, who was to leave on a public mission next day. So at the dawn of day he put on his dressing gown and went to the Governor's room. He found the door unlocked and the Governor fast asleep. He shook him. Half asleep, the Governor sprang up and threw his arms around Mr. Chesnut's neck and said, "Honey, is it you?" The mistake was rapidly set right, and the bewildered plenipotentiary was given his instructions. Mr. Chesnut came into my room, threw himself on the sofa, and nearly laughed himself to extinction, imitating again and again the pathetic tone of the Governor's greeting. Mr. Chesnut calls Lawrence Adolphe, but says he is simply perfect as a servant. Mary Stevens said, "I thought Cousin James the laziest man alive until I knew his man Lawrence." Lawrence will not move an inch or lift a finger for any one but his master. Mrs. Middleton politely sent him on an errand. Lawrence, too, was very polite. Hours after, she saw him sitting on the fence of the front yard. "Didn't you go?" she asked. "No, ma'am, I am waiting for Mars Jeems." Mrs. Middleton calls him now Mr. Take It Easy. My very last day's experience at the Congaree. I was waiting for Mars Jeems in the drawing room when a lady there declared herself to be the wife of an officer in Clingman's regiment. A gentleman who seemed quite friendly with her told her all Mr. Chesnut said, thought, intended to do, wrote, and felt. I asked, "Are you certain of all these things you say of Colonel Chesnut?" The man hardly deigned to notice this impertinent interruption from a stranger presuming to speak, but who had not been introduced. After he went out, the wife of Clingman's officer was seized with an intuitive curiosity. "Madam, will you tell me your name?" I gave it, adding, "I dare say I showed myself an intelligent listener when my husband's affairs were under discussion." At first I refused to give my name because it would have embarrassed her friend if she had told him who I was. The man was Mr. Chesnut's secretary, but I had never seen him before. A letter from Kate says she had been up all night preparing David's things. Little Serena sat up and helped her mother. They did not know that they would ever see him again. Upon reading it, I wept, and James Chesnut cursed the Yankees. Gave the girls a quantity of flannel for soldiers' shirts, also a string of pearls to be raffled for at the gunboat fair. Mary Witherspoon has sent a silver teapot. We do not spare our precious things now. Our silver and gold, what are they, when we give up to war our beloved? April 2d. Dr. Trezevant, attending Mr. Chesnut, who was ill, came and found his patient gone. He could not stand the news of that last battle. He got up and dressed, weak as he was, and went forth to hear what he could for himself. The doctor was angry with me for permitting this, and more angry with him for such folly. I made him listen to the distinction between feminine folly and virulent vagaries and nonsense. He said, "He will certainly be salivated after all that calomel out in this damp weather." To day the ladies in their landaus were bitterly attacked by the morning paper for lolling back in their silks and satins, with tall footmen in livery, driving up and down the streets, while the poor soldiers' wives were on the sidewalks. It is the old story of rich and poor. My little barouche is not here, nor has James Chesnut any of his horses here. But then I drive every day with Mrs. McCord and Mrs. Preston, either of whose turnouts fits the bill. The Governor's carriage, horses, servants, etc., are splendid, just what they should be. Why not? April 14th. Our fair is in full blast. We keep a restaurant. Our waitresses are Mary and Buck Preston, Isabella Martin, and Grace Elmore. April 15th. Trescott is too clever ever to be a bore. That was proved to day, for he stayed 2 hours. As usual, Mr. Chesnut said 4. Trescott was very surly, calls himself ex-Secretary of State of the United States. Now nothing in particular of South Carolina or the Confederate States. Then he yawned, "What a bore this war is. I wish it was ended one way or another." He speaks of going across the border and taking service in Mexico. "Rubbish! Not much Mexico for you," I answered. Another patriot came then and averred, "I will take my family back to town, that we may all surrender together. I gave it up early in the spring." Trescott made a face behind backs and said, "Losh." The enemy have flanked Beauregard at Nashville. There is grief enough for Albert Sidney Johnston now; we begin to see what we have lost. We were pushing them into the river when General Johnston was wounded. Beauregard was lying in his tent at the rear, in a green sickness melancholy, but no matter what the name of the malady. He was too slow to move and lost all the advantage gained by our dead hero. Without him there is no head to our Western army. Pulaski has fallen. What more is there to fall? Footnote: The Battle of Shiloh, or Pittsburg Landing, in Tennessee, 88 miles east of Memphis, had been fought on April 6 and 7, 1862. The Federals were commanded by General Grant, who, on the second day, was reenforced by General Buell. The Confederates were commanded by Albert Sidney Johnston on the first day, when Johnston was killed, and on the second day by General Beauregard. April 15th. Mrs. Middleton. How did you settle Molly's little difficulty with Mrs. McMahon, that piece of her mind that Molly gave our landlady? Oh, paid our way out of it, of course, and I apologized for Molly. Gladden, the hero of the Palmettos, in Mexico, is killed. Shiloh has been a dreadful blow to us. Last winter Stephen, my brother, had it in his power to do such a nice thing for Colonel Gladden. In the dark he heard his name, also that he had to walk 25 miles in Alabama mud or go on an ammunition wagon. So he introduced himself as a South Carolinian to Colonel Gladden, whom he knew only by reputation as colonel of the Palmetto Regiment in the Mexican War. And they drove him in his carriage comfortably to where he wanted to go, a night drive of 50 miles for Stephen, for he had the return trip, too. I would rather live in Siberia, worse still in Sahara, than live in a country surrendered to Yankees. The Carolinian says the conscription bill passed by Congress is fatal to our liberties as a people. Let us be a people "certain and sure," as poor Tom B. said, and then talk of rebelling against our home government. Sat up all night. Read Eothen straight through, our old Wiley and Putnam edition that we bought in London in 1845. How could I sleep? The power they are bringing to bear against our country is tremendous. Its weight may be irresistible. Dare not think of that, however. April 21st. Have been ill. One day I dined at Mrs. Preston's, pâté de foie gras and partridge prepared for me as I liked them. I had been awfully depressed for days, and could not sleep at night for anxiety, but I did not know that I was bodily ill. Mrs. Preston came home with me. She said emphatically, "Molly, if your mistress is worse in the night, send for me instantly." I thought it very odd. I could not breathe if I attempted to lie down, and very soon I lost my voice. Molly raced out and sent Lawrence for Dr. Trezevant. She said I had the croup. The doctor said congestion of the lungs. So here I am, stranded, laid by the heels. Battle after battle has occurred, disaster after disaster. Every morning's paper is enough to kill a well woman and age a strong and hearty one. To day the waters of this stagnant pool were wildly stirred. The President telegraphed for my husband to come on to Richmond and offered him a place on his staff. I was a joyful woman. It was a way opened by Providence from this slough of despond, this counsel whose counsel no one takes. I wrote to Mr. Davis, "With thanks, and begging your pardon, how I would like to go." Mrs. Preston agrees with me; Mr. Chesnut ought to go. Through Mr. Chesnut the President might hear many things to the advantage of our State, etc. Letter from Quinton Washington. That was the best tonic yet. He writes so cheerfully. We have 50,000 men on the Peninsula, and McClellan 80,000. We expect that much disparity of numbers. We can stand that. April 23d. On April 23, 1840, I was married, aged 17. Consequently, on the 31st of March, 1862, I was 39. I saw a wedding to day from my window, which opens on Trinity Church. Nana Shand married a Dr. Wilson. Then a beautiful bevy of girls rushed into my room. Such a flutter and a chatter. Well, thank heaven for a wedding. It is a charming relief from the dismal litany of our daily song. A letter to day from our octogenarian at Mulberry. His nephew, Jack Dees, had 2 horses shot under him. The old Colonel has his growl, "That's enough for glory, and no hurt after all." He ends, however, with his never failing refrain, "We can't fight all the world, 2 and 2 only make 4, it can't make 1,000, numbers will not lie." He says he has lost half a million already in railroad bonds, bank stock, Western notes of hand, not to speak of negroes to be freed and lands to be confiscated, for he takes the gloomiest views of all things. April 26th. Doleful dumps, alarm bells ringing. Telegrams say the mortar fleet has passed the forts at New Orleans. Down into the very depths of despair are we. April 27th. New Orleans gone, and with it the Confederacy. That Mississippi ruins us if lost. The Confederacy has been done to death by the politicians. What wonder we are lost. Footnote: New Orleans had been seized by the Confederates at the outbreak of the war. Steps to capture it were soon taken by the Federals, and on April 18, 1862, the mortar flotilla, under Farragut, opened fire on its protecting forts. Making little impression on them, Farragut ran boldly past the forts and destroyed the Confederate fleet, comprising 13 gunboats and 2 ironclads. On April 27th he took formal possession of the city. End footnote. The soldiers have done their duty. All honor to the army. Statesmen as busy as bees about their own places, or their personal honor, too busy to see the enemy at a distance. With a microscope they were examining their own interests, or their own wrongs, forgetting the interests of the people they represented. They were concocting newspaper paragraphs to injure the government. No matter how vital it may be, nothing can be kept from the enemy. They must publish themselves night and day what they are doing, or the omniscient Buncombe will forget them. The fall of New Orleans means utter ruin to the private fortunes of the Prestons. Mr. Preston came from New Orleans so satisfied with Mansfield Lovell and the tremendous steam rams he saw there. While in New Orleans, Burnside offered Mr. Preston $500,000, a debt due to him from Burnside, and he refused to take it. He said the money was safer in Burnside's hands than his. And so it may prove, so ugly is the outlook now. Burnside is wide awake. He is not a man to be caught napping. Mary Preston was saying she had asked the Hamptons how they relished the idea of being paupers. If the country is saved, none of us will care for that sort of thing. Philosophical and patriotic, Mr. Chesnut came in, saying, "Conrad has been telegraphed from New Orleans that the great ironclad Louisiana went down at the first shot." Mr. Chesnut and Mary Preston walked off, first to the bulletin board, and then to the Prestons. End of chapter 11, part 3. Part 4 of A Diary from Dixie. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Laurie Anne Walden. A Diary from Dixie by Mary Chesnut. Chapter 11, Columbia, South Carolina, Part 4. April 29th. A grand smash, the news from New Orleans fatal to us. Met Mr. Weston. He wanted to know where he could find a place of safety for 200 negroes. I looked into his face to see if he were in earnest, then to see if he were sane. There was a certain set of 200 negroes that had grown to be a nuisance. Apparently all the white men of the family had felt bound to stay at home to take care of them. There are people who still believe negroes property, like Noah's neighbors who insisted that the deluge would only be a little shower after all. These negroes, however, were Plowden Weston's, a totally different part of speech. He gave field rifles to one company and $40,000 to another. He is away with our army at Corinth. So I said, "You may rely upon Mr. Chesnut, who will assist you to his uttermost in finding a home for these people. Nothing belonging to that patriotic gentleman shall come to grief if we have to take charge of them on our own place." Mr. Chesnut did get a place for them, as I said he would. Had to go to the Governor's or they would think we had hoisted the black flag. Heard there we are going to be beaten as Cortez beat the Mexicans, by superior arms. Mexican bows and arrows made a poor showing in the face of Spanish accoutrements. Our enemies have such superior weapons of war, we hardly any but what we capture from them in the fray. The Saxons and the Normans were in the same plight. War seems a game of chess, but we have an unequal number of pawns to begin with. We have knights, kings, queens, bishops, and castles enough. But our skillful generals, whenever they can not arrange the board to suit them exactly, burn up everything and march away. We want them to save the country. They seem to think their whole duty is to destroy ships and save the army. Mr. Robert Barnwell wrote that he had to hang his head for South Carolina. We had not furnished our quota of the new levy, 5,000 men. Today Colonel Chesnut published his statement to show that we have sent 13,000 instead of the mere number required of us, so Mr. Barnwell can hold up his head again. April 30th, the last day of this month of calamities. Lovell left the women and children to be shelled and took the army to a safe place. I do not understand why we do not send the women and children to the safe place and let the army stay where the fighting is to be. Armies are to save, not to be saved. At least, to be saved is not their raison d'être exactly. If this goes on, the spirit of our people will be broken. One ray of comfort comes from Henry Marshall. Our Army of the Peninsula is fine, so good I do not think McClellan will venture to attack it. So mote it be. May 6th. Mine is a painful, self-imposed task, but why write when I have nothing to chronicle but disaster? Footnote: The siege of Yorktown was begun on April 5, 1862, the place being evacuated by the Confederates on May 4th. End footnote. So I read instead. First Consuelo, then Columba, two ends of the pole certainly, and then a translated edition of Elective Affinities. Food enough for thought in every one of this odd assortment of books. At the Prestons', where I am staying, because Mr. Chesnut has gone to see his crabbed old father, whom he loves, and who is reported ill, I met Christopher Hampton. He tells us Wigfall is out on a warpath, wants them to strike for Maryland. The President's opinion of the move is not given. Also Mr. Hampton met the first lieutenant of the Kirkwoods, E. M. Boykin, says he is just the same man he was in the South Carolina College. In whatever company you may meet him, he is the pleasantest man there. A telegram reads, "We have repulsed the enemy at Williamsburg." Footnote: The Battle of Williamsburg was fought on May 5, 1862, by a part of McClellan's army under General Hooker and others, the Confederates being commanded by General Johnston. End footnote. Oh, if we could drive them back to their ain country! Richmond was hard pressed this day. The Mercury of to day says, Jeff Davis now treats all men as if they were idiotic insects. Mary Preston said all sisters quarreled. No, we never quarrel, I and mine. We keep all our bitter words for our enemies. We are frank heathens, we hate our enemies and love our friends. Some people, our kind, can never make up after a quarrel. Hard words once only, and all is over. To us, forgiveness is impossible. Forgiveness means calm indifference, philosophy while love lasts. Forgiveness of love's wrongs is impossible. Those dutiful wives who piously overlook, well, everything, do not care one fig for their husbands. I settled that in my own mind years ago. Some people think it magnanimous to praise their enemies and to show their impartiality and justice by acknowledging the faults of their friends. I am for the simple rule, the good old plan, I praise whom I love and abuse whom I hate. Mary Preston has been translating Schiller aloud. We are provided with Bulwer's translation, Mrs. Austin's, Coleridge's, and Carlyle's, and we show how each renders the passage Mary is to convert into English. In Wallenstein, at one point of the Max and Thekla scene, I like Carlyle better than Coleridge, though they say Coleridge's Wallenstein is the only translation in the world half so good as the original. Mrs. Barstow repeated some beautiful scraps by Uhland, which I had never heard before. She is to write them for us. Peace and a literary leisure for my old age, unbroken by care and anxiety. General Preston accused me of degenerating into a boarding house gossip. and is answered triumphantly by his daughters, "But, papa, one you love to gossip with full well." Hampton estate has 1,500 negroes on Lake Washington, Mississippi. Hampton girls talking in the language of James's novels. Neither Wade nor Preston, that splendid boy, would lay a lance in rest, or couch it, which is the right phrase for fighting, to preserve slavery. They hate it as we do. What are they fighting for? Southern rights, whatever that is. And they do not want to be understrappers forever to the Yankees. They talk well enough about it, but I forget what they say. Johnny Chesnut says, "No use to give a reason, a fellow could not stay away from the fight, not well." It takes 4 negroes to wait on Johnny satisfactorily. It is this giving up that kills me. Norfolk they talk of now; why not Charleston next? I read in a Western letter, not Beauregard, but the soldiers who stopped to drink the whiskey they had captured from the enemy, lost us Shiloh. Cock Robin is as dead as he ever will be now. What matters it who killed him? May 12th. Mr. Chesnut says he is very glad he went to town. Everything in Charleston is so much more satisfactory than it is reported. Troops are in good spirits. It will take a lot of ironclads to take that city. Isaac Hayne said at dinner yesterday that both Beauregard and the President had a great opinion of Mr. Chesnut's natural ability for strategy and military evolution. Honorable Mr. Barnwell concurred; that is, Mr. Barnwell had been told so by the President. Then why did not the President offer me something better than an aideship? I heard he offered to make you a general last year, and you said you could not go over other men's shoulders until you had earned promotion. You are too hard to please. No, not exactly that. I was only offered a colonelcy, and Mr. Barnwell persuaded me to stick to the Senate. Then he wanted my place, and between the 2 stools I fell to the ground. My Molly will forget Liege and her babies, too. I asked her who sent me that beautiful bouquet I found on my center table. "I give it to you; 'twas give to me." And Molly was all wriggle, giggle, blush. May 18th. Norfolk has been burned, and the Merrimac sunk without striking a blow since her coup d'état in Hampton Roads. Read Milton. See the speech of Adam to Eve in a new light. Women will not stay at home, will go out to see and be seen, even if it be by the devil himself. Very encouraging letters from Honorable Mr. Memminger and from L.Q. Washington. They tell the same story in very different words. It amounts to this: not 1 foot of Virginia soil is to be given up without a bitter fight for it. We have 105,000 men in all, McClellan 190,000. We can stand that disparity. What things I have been said to have said! Mr. heard me make scoffing remarks about the Governor and the Council, or he thinks he heard me. James Chesnut wrote him a note that my name was to be kept out of it; indeed, that he was never to mention my name again under any possible circumstances. It was all preposterous nonsense, but it annoyed my husband amazingly. He said it was a scheme to use my chatter to his injury. He was very kind about it. He knows my real style so well that he can always tell my real impudence from what is fabricated for me. There is said to be an order from Butler turning over the women of New Orleans to his soldiers. Thus is the measure of his iniquities filled. We thought that generals always restrained, by shot or sword if need be, the brutality of soldiers. This hideous, cross-eyed beast orders his men to treat the ladies of New Orleans as women of the town, to punish them, he says, for their insolence. Footnote: General Benjamin F. Butler took command of New Orleans on May 2, 1862. The author's reference is to his famous Order No. 28, which reads, "As the officers and soldiers of the United States have been subject to repeated insults from the women, calling themselves ladies, of New Orleans, in return for the most scrupulous non interference and courtesy on our part, it is ordered that hereafter when any female shall, by word, gesture, or movement, insult or show contempt for any officer or soldier of the United States, she shall be regarded and held liable to be treated as a woman of the town plying her vocation." This and other acts of Butler in New Orleans led Jefferson Davis to issue a proclamation declaring Butler to be a felon and an outlaw, and if captured that he should be instantly hanged. In December Butler was superseded at New Orleans by General Banks. Footprints on the boundaries of another world once more. Willie Taylor, before he left home for the army, fancied one day, remember, that he saw Albert Rhett standing by his side. He recoiled from the ghostly presence. "You need not do that, Willie; you will soon be as I am." Willie rushed into the next room to tell them what had happened, and fainted. It had a very depressing effect upon him. And now the other day he died in Virginia. May 24th. The enemy are landing at Georgetown. With a little more audacity, where could they not land? But we have given them such a scare they are cautious. If it be true, I hope some cool headed white men will make the negroes save the rice for us. It is so much needed. They say it might have been done at Port Royal with a little more energy. South Carolinians have pluck enough, but they only work by fits and starts; there is no continuous effort; they can't be counted on for steady work. They will stop to play, or enjoy life in some shape. Without let or hindrance, Halleck is being reenforced. Beauregard, unmolested, was making some fine speeches, and issuing proclamations, while we were fatuously looking for him to make a tiger's spring on Huntsville. Why not? Hope springs eternal in the Southern breast. My Hebrew friend, Mem Cohen, has a son in the war. He is in John Chesnut's company. Cohen is a high name among the Jews; it means Aaron. She has long fits of silence, and is absent minded. If she is suddenly roused, she is apt to say, with overflowing eyes and clasped hands, "If it please God to spare his life." Her daughter is the sweetest little thing. The son is the mother's idol. Mrs. Cohen was Miriam de Leon. I have known her intimately all my life. Mrs. Bartow, the widow of Colonel Bartow, who was killed at Manassas, was Miss Berrien, daughter of Judge Berrien, of Georgia. She is now in one of the departments here cutting bonds, Confederate bonds, for 500 Confederate dollars a year, a penniless woman. Judge Carroll, her brother in law, has been urgent with her to come and live in his home. He has a large family, and she will not be an added burden to him. In spite of all he can say, she will not forego her resolution. She will be independent. She is a resolute little woman, with the softest, silkiest voice and ways, and clever to the last point. Columbia is the place for good living, pleasant people, pleasant dinners, pleasant drives. I feel that I have put the dinners in the wrong place. They are the climax of the good things here. This is the most hospitable place in the world, and the dinners are worthy of it. In Washington there was an endless succession of state dinners. I was kindly used. I do not remember ever being condemned to two dull neighbors; on one side or the other was a clever man. So I liked Washington dinners. In Montgomery there were a few dinners, Mrs. Pollard's for instance, but the society was not smoothed down or in shape. Such as it was given over to balls and suppers. In Charleston, Mr. Chesnut went to gentlemen's dinners all the time, no ladies present. Flowers were sent to me, and I was taken to drive and asked to tea. There could not have been nicer suppers, more perfect of their kind than were to be found at the winding up of those festivities. In Richmond there were balls, which I did not attend, very few to which I was asked. The McFarlands and Lyons, all I can remember. James Chesnut dined out nearly every day. But then the breakfasts, the Virginia breakfasts, where were always pleasant people. Indeed, I have had a good time everywhere, always clever people, and people I liked, and everybody so good to me. Here in Columbia, family dinners are the specialty. You call, or they pick you up and drive home with you. "Oh, stay to dinner," and you stay gladly. They send for your husband, and he comes willingly. Then comes a perfect dinner. You do not see how it could be improved, and yet they have not had time to alter things or add because of the unexpected guests. They have everything of the best, silver, glass, china, table linen, and damask, etc. And then the planters live within themselves, as they call it. From the plantations come mutton, beef, poultry, cream, butter, eggs, fruits, and vegetables. It is easy to live here with a cook who has been sent for training to the best eating house in Charleston. Old Mrs. Chesnut's Romeo was apprenticed at Jones's. I do not know where Mrs. Preston's got his degree, but he deserves a medal. At the Prestons', James Chesnut induced Buck to declaim something about Joan of Arc, which she does in a manner to touch all hearts. While she was speaking, my husband turned to a young gentleman who was listening to the chatter of several girls, and said, "Écoutez." The youth stared at him a moment in bewilderment, then gravely rose and began turning down the gas. Isabella said, "Écoutez, then, means put out the lights." I recall a scene which took place during a ball given by Mrs. Preston while her husband was in Louisiana. Mrs. Preston was resplendent in diamonds, point lace, and velvet. There is a gentle dignity about her which is very attractive; her voice is low and sweet, and her will is iron. She is exceedingly well informed, but very quiet, retiring, and reserved. Indeed, her apparent gentleness almost amounts to timidity. She has chiseled regularity of features, a majestic figure, perfectly molded. Governor Manning said to me, "Look at Sister Caroline. Does she look as if she had the pluck of a heroine?" Then he related how a little while ago William, the butler, came to tell her that John, the footman, was drunk in the cellar, mad with drink; that he had a carving knife which he was brandishing in drunken fury, and he was keeping everybody from their business, threatening to kill any one who dared to go into the basement. They were like a flock of frightened sheep down there. She did not speak to one of us, but followed William down to the basement, holding up her skirts. She found the servants scurrying everywhere, screaming and shouting that John was crazy and going to kill them. John was bellowing like a bull of Bashan, knife in hand, chasing them at his pleasure. Mrs. Preston walked up to him. "Give me that knife," she demanded. He handed it to her. She laid it on the table. "Now come with me," she said, putting her hand on his collar. She led him away to the empty smoke house, and there she locked him in and put the key in her pocket. Then she returned to her guests, without a ripple on her placid face. She told me of it, smiling and serene as you see her now, the Governor concluded. Before the war shut him in, General Preston sent to the lakes for his salmon, to Mississippi for his venison, to the mountains for his mutton and grouse. It is good enough, the best dish at all these houses, what the Spanish call the hearty welcome. Thackeray says at every American table he was first served with grilled hostess. At the head of the table sat a person, fiery faced, anxious, nervous, inwardly murmuring, like Falstaff, "Would it were night, Hal, and all were well." At Mulberry the house is always filled to overflowing, and one day is curiously like another. People are coming and going, carriages driving up or driving off. It has the air of a watering place, where one does not pay, and where there are no strangers. At Christmas the china closet gives up its treasures. The glass, china, silver, fine linen reserved for grand occasions come forth. As for the dinner itself, it is only a matter of greater quantity, more turkey, more mutton, more partridges, more fish, etc., and more solemn stiffness. Usually a half dozen persons unexpectedly dropping in make no difference. The family let the housekeeper know, that is all. People are beginning to come here from Richmond. One swallow does not make a summer, but it shows how the wind blows, these straws do, Mrs. Constitution Brown and Mrs. Wise. The Gibsons are at Dr. Gibbes's. It does look squally. We are drifting on the breakers. End of chapter 11, part 4.